Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Leslie with SQFI again. It's now 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, so we're just going to go ahead and begin the webinar presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time out to join us today. Today's presentation will be led by some members of EAGLE Certification Group. Specifically, you'll be listening to the lovely voices of Skip Greenaway. He's the president and CEO of EAGLE, and also Michael Urbaugh and Steve Brown will be leading the presentation. Now, some protocol that I'd like to get to before we start. I would like everyone to please keep in mind that if you have any questions at all during the presentation, please feel free to write them in the chat section of the webinar. What we're going to do is we'll just give that to the presenters, and they will be more than happy to answer that at the conclusion of the presentation. And also, there is going to be a recording of this webinar, which will be posted on the events page of SQFI.com. But just keep in mind that it will be posted 1 to 2 weeks after today's presentation. So in a couple weeks, just make sure you check back on the website and look for the presentation. All right, so that is it for logistics. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic over to Skip, who will kick us off.
Thank you, Leslie. Good day, everyone. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend our learning lunch about SQF's new revised ethical sourcing standard. Ethical sourcing was originally developed in 2010, and if you could switch to the next slide. There we go. And okay, next slide. Okay, one more slide. One more. Nobody wants to see my name again. Oh. Okay, ethical sourcing was originally developed in 2010 as a voluntary supplement for SQF certified suppliers whose customers require independent assessment of their commitment to the implementation of responsible trading, labor care, and environmental practices. Ethical sourcing has been revised and strengthened to facilitate the application beyond the food sector, hopefully to help our customers like our packaging folks who go beyond just food. In addition, we believe even non-food businesses can benefit from our revised code. The new ethical sourcing code harmonizes and aligns with the SQF food code. We have worked with the Global Social Compliance Program this past year, also known as GSCP, and I like to refer to them as the sister company, the GFSI. This effort has allowed ethical sourcing to be associated with GSCP's Worldwide Best Practices program. In addition, we have taken ISO 14001 and OSAS 18001 and captured the key elements in both of these worldwide standards. And finally, we have worked with ANAB this past year, the United States accreditation body, also a sister company to ANSI, to work towards achieving ISO 17021 accreditation, to allow for ethical sourcing to become one of the few sustainable worldwide standards to be accredited to 17021. This allows the same independent oversight that our food safety effort is committed to, and gives our customer and our customer's customer the added confidence in this new 17021 certification audit. Next slide, please. Some call it sustainability. I have also used this word in this brief introduction. Some of you call it social responsibility, some environmental protection. But SQF Ethical Sourcing, that is our name, our code. But this revised code, no matter what you call your plan, is still about your plan. It's about your name. We are comfortable saying that the new code gives us the ability to audit to requirements, but understanding these requirements, you will find that your plan can fit inside of this new code with the emphasis on continuous improvement. Last, we have worked hard at establishing that both small and large companies can navigate through the process and have a robust system that we all can be proud of. We are fortunate, next slide please, today to have the two key people who helped with the rewrite of ethical sourcing. Stephen Brown and Michael Urbaugh together have over 60 years of both environmental, health and safety, social programs, best business practices in their professional careers of auditing, consulting, training, and teaching in some food businesses, but primarily in non-food. Now, here is our two experts, Steve and Mike, to take us through the positive changes.
Okay, thank you, Skip, for that excellent segue into what Mike and I will be covering are predominantly the nuts and bolts of the standard and the supporting documents. Next slide, please, Leslie. The first slide really lays out the 6 elements in the standard itself. We'll be covering those in the next series of slides individually, but I did want to just tee up that there are 6 primary elements, and they are supported by 4 appendices. As we discuss the components of the standard as in the appendices as we move forward, I'd like you to think about a couple of things to keep in mind. One is the linkages that you will likely make in your own mind with the types of programs and processes that you currently have in place. Many of you already have well-established environment, health, and safety programs, human resources or employment-related programs, supplier qualification programs, etc. This standard builds upon those types of processes that a number of clients already have in place. And the drivers for some of those can be regulatory requirements, whether those are national, state, provincial, or local regulations. They can be corporate policies and requirements. They can be customer or sourcing organization requirements, or they can come from non-governmental organizations and even communities where some of your facilities are located. And so you're looking at employment management practices or social management, EHS management practices, business management, and supplier and subcontractor management practices, sometimes in different contexts. I think at least one of the main advantages of the SQFI Ethical Sourcing Code is it pulls all of those considerations into one standard, and not only one standard, but one, as Skip mentioned, that will be independently accredited by a national accreditation body. Also, we've had some indications from a couple of sourcing organizations that the Ethical Sourcing Code would satisfy their requirements for their downstream supply chain. So hopefully that could end up with eliminating some overlapping audits or the number of audits and the time that's necessary for those. So there could be a couple of good advantages as we move forward. Next slide, please. Again, as I walk through the major elements of the standard itself, some of these are going to sound very familiar. In the first element on commitment, the requirements in that element include having an ethical sourcing policy. Many of you already have policy statements in your organization. And those are good words that are hung on the wall to guide the behavior of the organization. But the good words aren't enough. We need to be able to put those words into practice. So many of you may have operational manuals currently that are the policies and procedures that support your governing policy. And you may also have business practices, guidelines, and all of those combined to help you achieve the good words that are in the policy. And that's a requirement of the ethical sourcing standard. A company representative, a senior management individual that would have overall responsibility for the ethical sourcing process and programs would be required by the standard. But obviously that person is not going to be the working group of folks. So supporting the company representative would be a team of folks who are appropriately positioned in the organization to handle these types of considerations, whether they be health and safety or environmental or human resources related, et cetera. And then making sure that all of those folks have the appropriate training to understand the context and the requirements of the standard and to be able to fulfill their responsibilities appropriately. The next element deals with suppliers and subcontractors. So now we're moving not only for our organization, we're looking further down the supply chain. what are the selection criteria that we should have in place to help guide our actions and our commitments to ethical sourcing, and how do we periodically evaluate folks in the supply chain to make sure that they maintain that level of performance? How do we keep records so that those are available for appropriate review as necessary, internally and externally? So those are the first major elements of the standard. Next slide, please. Element 4.3 deals with social management programs. I could term this human resources related. I could say it's employment related. It's talking about not discriminating in terms of employment or opportunities post-employment, whether that be promotional opportunities, training opportunities, etc. Not harassing and abusing employees for a number of different reasons, whether that be sexual harassment, national origin, language-oriented, etc. Could take a number of different forms. We also are concerned about wage compliance. There is a strong emphasis in this standard on complying with various regulations. Well, I should step back. Not only complying, but identifying all of those regulations that apply to your operations and making sure that you're in compliance with those. That's a kind of a foundational requirement. Benefits, making sure that appropriate benefits are being paid to employees. And in the last bullet in that element, I bundled together, but there's a lot in that element: fair labor practices, terms of employment, ranging from hours of work, ranging from understanding of what is the disciplinary procedure, what's expected of me, what could happen if I don't meet those expectations, what is a progressive disciplinary or termination process. It also deals with topics such as child labor, such as forced or bonded labor and indentured labor. So there's quite a variety or quite a scope of activities that could be covered within social management programs. So those are spelled out in the standard. Element 4.4, those of you who have environmental health and safety programs in place will recognize that these are good practices, making sure that you have identified what are the key environmental impacts, not only within your facility, but ultimately within the environment outside of your facility, and what are the risks that your operations pose to your employees and beyond your fence line. What are the regulations, as I mentioned, that apply to your facility, and putting all of that into environmental health and safety management plans to make sure that we are controlling and ultimately, hopefully, reducing, through continual improvement, reducing the impacts on the environment and our employees. And then lastly, in the last bullet, managing incidents appropriately, the emphasis being on identifying the types of emergency scenarios that could happen at your facilities. How do we respond to those? What capabilities do we need in place, either internally and or externally, to prevent incidents from occurring or to mitigate incidents should they occur? Next slide, please. And in the last two elements, there's a large grouping under monitoring and management review. Those of you who are certified or facilities that are certified to an international ISO standard, for instance, would recognize this as being on the Plan, Do, Check Act. These would be a number of the checking type elements. Having a robust internal audit process, one of your key processes to have in place to drive continual improvement, is to take a good, thorough look at yourself and determine where we have opportunities to continually improve, to monitor some of the key characteristics of your facilities by means of, could be key performance indices or other measures that you have in place to make sure that you stay on track, and also to look at what types of objectives, targets, and programs might we need in place to continually drive performance improvement. The third bullet, investigating employee concerns. Those concerns could arise from environmental considerations, health and safety, wage, hour, any number of any of the areas that we've already discussed, and make sure that those concerns are given appropriate consideration and an appropriate response is provided for employees. Taking in the next bullet all of those considerations, all of those findings, concerns, et cetera, and making sure that we have an active corrective and preventive action program in place to address any findings and, again, to drive continual improvement, making sure we keep appropriate records, not only that are required by governmental regulations, but also by customers, et cetera, any entity within the ethical sourcing process. And then periodically, management reviewing performance on the whole system or program to make sure that it continually drives. Is it adequately resourced? Is it given appropriate attention within the organization? Are we appropriately driving improvement within the process? And then the last two would be the management principles for senior management. I'm sure that every organization represented on this call has measures and requirements in place that look at the financial health of the organization, the economic health of the organization, the environmental health and safety, the marketing, R&D, et cetera, health of the organization, but asking you to bring those same kinds of concepts to look at ethical sourcing. What are the benefits to be derived from a good, active ethical sourcing program? What approach will you use within your organization to make sure that you drive improvement, and what actions are expected of senior management to help support the approach that has been considered? So next slide, please. I'm going to turn the mic over to Mike Erbaugh, who's going to take you through the next couple of slides.
Thank you, Steve. One of the things that we want to talk about with the standard is how it's split up into the different appendices. The appendices were put in place as kind of tools to help everyone go through the program. The first one, appendix number 1, you can see that there's 13 sub-elements. What happens is the 13 sub-elements align with the 6 major elements that Steve just talked about. And these would be the criteria that we'd be looking at to see conformance with the ethical sourcing standard. As you can see, they're looking at most of these that they're probably things you're already doing. And you're going to hear this time and time again, don't remake the wheel. If you're already doing something, bring that into your program. One of the things that Steve and I always say, you call it apples, I'll call it oranges. It doesn't matter as long as we're talking about the same thing. Next slide, please. Also, we're talking about these, in Appendix 1, we're talking about the 3 certification levels. The level number 1 is going to be the entry level. And as we can see there that, this is where most of the organizations are probably going to come in. And, what determines what level of that you're going to need, there's a lot of different things there. The resources that you have, your customer requirements, organizational commitments, and there might be many, many other things that are going to require different levels to come in. But when we're looking at level 1, we're looking at within the fence line. What are you doing within the areas there to work on this program? And then when we get to level 2, now we're starting to look at the surrounding, the local community. And then finally, when we look at level 3, when we get into level 3, we're looking at how do we impact further than that. We're a global economy. We can't just look in our backyard anymore. And so these are some of the things that the different levels are going to apply. One of the important notes here, and Steve is going to hit on this just a little later, about some comparisons between ethical sourcing and the current SQF standard, is that where in SQF, the level 1 is a self-assessment. In ethical sourcing, this is a certification level as well. And so as you're progressing, you would need to maintain. In working with the ANAB and to stay conformant with 17021, we've made this, like we said, a certificated level. Next slide, please. A couple examples of the difference between, say, a level 2 certification and a level 3 certification. If we're looking at the programs here, we have requirement 3.1 has the organization established, documented, and implemented processes and programs to achieve established objectives and targets. When we're looking at this, if we're looking again at the level 1, we're looking at, again, within the fence line. Here the focus is on operations, activities, and potential environmental health and safety concerns, social impacts at the site level. This group that we're using as an example has expanded a little bit now and is satisfying level 2. The focus has been on expanded to consider how the site influences and interacts with the local environment and community beyond the physical boundaries. Once again, we've stepped outside the fence now. The organization has went now and they've tightened their programs. This is that continual improvement that you'll always hear us talk about in any audit. You know, we don't want the program to become stagnant, but how are you making things better? If we look at the level 3 here, consideration has been given to potential impacts on and influence over activities beyond the immediate consideration of the site and local environment community. This group has not stepped into that yet. So if we go on to the next slide now, here we've got a different group, and this group now has stepped beyond level 2 and has gone to level 3. One of my favorites, 11.1, have plans and procedures been developed and implemented to identify and potential incident emergency situations, as well as preventing, mitigating potential illness, injuries that may be associated with them. When we're looking at the level 1, again, have they documented the potential scenarios that could happen? Have they done risk management or risk assessments? At this level, we've got documentation includes prevention, mitigation, actions for all identified potential environmental health and safety emergency situations. Remember, though, when we're looking at level 1 and we're still talking within the fence line, remember, if you have sales personnel that are outside, those folks still are considered within the fence line in this level. That's a little bit of a difference there as far as it's still a risk that is internally handled. When we get to level 2 with this example, the organization now works with the local community emergency agencies. It has gone in with the local emergency planning committee, LEPC, and they've worked on their response actions, general emergencies, and communications back and forth. The community right to know information. Are we maybe even drilling with the local fire departments and things like that? But now this group has moved to level 3 as far as this element's concerned. Here we have evaluation of potential environmental health and safety emergency scenario has been expanded to assess potential impact and the customer and other stakeholders. This is the first time we're looking at interruption of supply chain now. What kind of issues do we have in-house that could stop our materials from getting to our customers? And that's important because as you all know, it only takes a second to lose a customer and takes years to get them back. So this is something that we want to think about at this level. Here we've got the suppliers and contractors are required to submit contingency plans in case of emergencies to prevent supply chain disruption. So it's very important. Next slide, please. When we're looking at the Appendix 2, what's Appendix 2 doing for us now? This is guidance, it says right there, for auditing. And what that's going to do is going to help us better understand the letter and the intent of the standard. A lot of the different ISO standards have guides to the standard. 14001 has 14004. And so this way, the guide is kind of built right in with the appendices. It's also going to help promote consistency and reduce subjective interpretations. That's one of the big things that we're always asking the client. Do you see any inconsistency in what the last auditor said or what we said last time. We always want to be consistent. The annexes, that's also in Appendix 2, helps give insight to potential issues in the agri-food industry, and also it's tools for helping us implement and identify, prioritize risk of the different areas, social topics, environmental topics. How are those working their ways into your program? Next slide. And then also, when we're looking at Appendix 2, the implementation guide, what's it mean? So there we've got some interpretation of the requirement. And then there's also some nice examples in there. The auditing guidance, suggestions on what the auditor will look at during the audit. This is kind of like getting the answers to the test before you have to take the test. And the symbol there is going to reference the areas that are mandatory for the standards. So, those are going to be certification assessment requirements. Again, helping the people implement the program. Next slide. And I'm going to give it back to Steve at this point.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Appendix 3 is a rather detailed document that includes, it has 3 parts as you can see on the slide, but Part A is really the meat of that appendix that talks about how do I go about implementing and maintaining the ethical sourcing standard. The previous slides talked a little bit about what the components are and what the requirements might be, but how do I get started? So you would, those of you who are SQF Code certified or registered, this will be a similar process through the SQFI website to register. So how you go about doing that is identified in this appendix. How do you select which of those 3 levels that Mike addressed? Just a kind of a point of emphasis. One consideration we try to be very sensitive to is that potential users or implementers of this code can represent a wide variety of organizations in terms of size, resources available, etc. How do we make a code that can hopefully meet the needs of that broad of a group? And so that's one reason why the levels are there with differing requirements. Maybe an organization decides, well, given the time, energy, money, resources period that I have, I prefer to choose level 1. And so there's some guidance on how to go about selecting levels, and then how do I move through certification levels. Generally, you would select a level, and I'll come back to what we'll call scoring in a minute. But generally, you would decide which of those 3 levels you want to pursue, and then there are certain requirements for each of those to achieve. There's a minimum requirement, but they build on each other. They're additive, if you will. So if you start out with level 1, then you'd be required to achieve a certain score on level 1. If you want to move to level 2, you have to satisfy all of the requirements of level 1 and then meet the minimum score on level 2. Same process if you were moving between level 2 and level 3. The initial certification process or the certification audits will be a 2-stage process. We originally were working on a little different concept, but in order for us to be able to satisfactorily achieve accreditation through ANAB, ANSI ANAB, we were required to go to a 2-stage certification process. So that's been incorporated into the standard. Surveillance has a little different concept in the SQF code in that, if I understand it correctly, it has a little bit of a penalty aspect to it, where if you're not satisfactorily completing all the requirements to successfully pass the audit, you may have to have a follow-up surveillance audit. In the context of the Ethical Sourcing Code, the surveillance audits are more associated with the ISO standards, where you would have an initial registration assessment, the 2-stage certification audits, if you will, and it will be a 3-year certification cycle. So the second year you would have a surveillance audit scheduled that would be shorter than the registration assessment. It would not include all of the elements and sub-elements, but certainly key elements. And then in the second intervening year, you would have another surveillance audit, and between those two, you would cover all elements. And then the third year would be the recertification process. You also have an opportunity in the code to move between levels midstream. Let's say you started as your organization in level 1, and as you've moved through the process, we think we're ready for level 2. You're not required to wait for the 3-year cycle. You can change, but you have to start again with a registration assessment, because we do have to again look at level 1 and then level 2. So this appendix provides guidance on to help you make those kinds of decisions. There's also an audit resource identification guide, if you will. This says how many people will be required, how many days will be required, the audit duration, the audit staffing, if you will, based on a number of criteria, very similar to 17021, which would be required for us to be accredited. And what comes into play there, again, are some basic days and auditor requirements, and then that could be additive based on the size of the facility, number of employees, other factors, whether you have other management systems in place, accredited management systems, et cetera. There are some other potential modifying factors. And then the last part is obligations, not only of organizations that are pursuing certification, but also certification bodies and their interaction with the scheme owner, which is the Safe Quality of Food Institute, and their interaction also with their accreditation body, which is ANAB or other similar organizations. Part B would talk about the ethical sourcing logo. It will be it's a mark that needs to be used and reproduced appropriately, so that guidance is provided. And then certainly there's an opportunity in Part C where folks will say, what does this mean? What does this term mean? It could mean something different in different schemes or in different standards. So we have provided that guidance for you in Appendix 3. Next slide, please. Some key features of that appendix. It's a not so much lengthy, but very detailed. So I wanted to pull out a few by the numbers. Again, 3 certification levels, being sensitive to size, complexity, resources of organizations, and the needs of your organization. Perhaps for an organization, would be a level 1 would be a fully accredited ethical sourcing management system, and that may be satisfactory in all your organization chooses to elect or to pursue. But there are 2 other levels. It will be an on-site Stage 1 and Stage 2 audits. The Stage 1 would be a combination of a document review that would be somewhat similar to the desk audits for folks who have implemented the SQF code, but there's also some on-site requirement to satisfy the 17021 requirements. The scoring is basically taken from the SQF code. You start at 100. And any findings of nonconformity would reduce your score from that 100. If it's a minor nonconformity, which is defined in Appendix 3, minor nonconformity would be a reduction of 1 point. If it's a major nonconformity, it would be a reduction of 5 points. And if it's a critical nonconformity, it would be a reduction of 50 points. And you can see you'd have to achieve, let's say, for the sake of example, I'm pursuing level 1, I would be required to achieve a minimum score of 70 to pass. If I had a critical nonconformity, that's a minus 50, I can't pass the assessment or the audit based on that one critical nonconformity. But I could have nonconformities that are minor or major that need to be addressed, and I can do that and still successfully achieve certification. Again, if I'm moving from level 1 to a higher level, I have to successfully implement all of the requirements of the lower level and then achieve at least a minimum score of 70 for the higher level. If I was going from 1 to 3, I would have to satisfy 1 and 2 and then achieve 70 on level 3. And it is a 3-year certification cycle with the original certification assessment, surveillance audits for the 2 intervening years, and then the recertification audit on the 3rd year, the 4th year in this case, unless you were changing levels. And then I mentioned that earlier, that would be a different approach. Next slide, please. And then the last element is we've talked so far predominantly about the standard and the requirements for implementing organizations. This element or this appendix deals primarily with auditors, and not internal auditors within your organization for your internal audit process, but registered SQFI registered auditors, so third-party independent auditors. The first section is what are the requirements for registration? What education is required of me, and what type of training, what type of work experience, what type of auditing experience is required of me as an auditor. What are the key competencies that I should have or other auditors should have in terms of general competencies, behavioral traits, techniques, etc., and then what specific competencies are needed from an ES-related standpoint, ethical sourcing standpoint, somewhat connected to the work and auditing experience requirement in the first section. And then lastly, auditor registration. What does that process look like for me to initiate the application? What's required in the application? How will the application be processed? What happens if I'm not selected as a registered auditor? What are my options from an appeal standpoint? What happens if I am selected and I start doing audits and the certification bodies start to receive, or SQFI starts to receive complaints about me as an auditor? How are those handled? And then because the standard drives continual improvement among implementing organizations, there's also the expectation that myself and other auditors will continue to continually improve our skills and capabilities. So there is a re-registration process that will have some requirements that I have to achieve. So those are the nuts and bolts, if you will, the standard itself and the 6 main elements and some information on the sub-elements within the standard, and then the 4 appendices that support the standard itself. Some of those keys, if you will, are Appendix 1 those are requirements. That's the format that the auditor will use to make sure that any organization achieves those requirements to successfully achieve certification. There are 3 different levels, and we've talked about those. Appendix 2 provides guidance for implementers and auditors. There's actually more of that document is information for implementers to help organizations understand what the letter and intent of the requirement is. And then also guidance for auditors, and by virtue of that, implementing organizations can look at the requirements for auditors and kind of know what we'll be looking for when we arrive. Appendix 3 lays out the whole certification process and how you get started, how you move through that whole process, achieving certification. And then level 4 is predominantly focused on independent SQFI registered auditors. Next slide, please. What we'd like to do on the remaining couple of slides for Mike and I is to talk about where do things stand currently and what's on the horizon. So, Mike, if you would, please. Next slide.
Thanks, Steve. Next slide. And right now, for the standard and the appendices, documents have been finalized, and we're ready to use those for pilot audits. The pilot audits are being conducted through May through July. That I'm not sure about that being extended. We'll let our hosts talk about that a little bit. But basically, what we're looking for is 2 large, 2 medium, and 2 small facilities. So, if you're willing to participate in that, please let SQFI know, and we can see if we can work you into one of those pilot programs. Also, we're looking at the GSCP equivalency assessment. The self-assessment's been completed, and the equivalency assessment by GSCP is currently underway. Right now, for the program's accreditation, the ANAB has the committee of experts has been formed, and the accreditation rules have been drafted and approved. And then, as far as the website, the SQFI website, that's going to be used for support certification, for heads-up type documents and things like that. And again, the SQFI can speak more on that as we go. And back to Steve.
Thanks, Mike. Next slide, please. Okay, some activities that are on the horizon. Obviously, this is a pilot process at this point. We have spent a lot of time and effort to try to make that as robust and workable as possible, but the proof of the pudding is in the ground truthing that will take place as we use it. So we are looking for, and have already incorporated, for example, feedback from the ANAB review by the Committee of Experts. We are in the process of having the equivalence assessment performed by the Global Social Compliance Program folks. We expect to receive some feedback there that we'll consider for incorporation. And the real key is from the pilot facilities, the auditors who are going to be using the tools, and the pilot facilities who will be the recipients of the initial audits to help us make this a better and more workable program. So client input and feedback is critical to the success of the documents and the structure of this whole standard. We want to determine if there are any additional tools that are needed, either by sourcing organizations, by supplier organizations, by the CBs or the certification bodies, and by the auditors that we can incorporate into the SQFI website, which right now the priority for that website has been setting up the functionality so that folks who are interested in registering can access and register, and then the interactions between the certification bodies and the scheme owner, et cetera. So those functionalities are kind of at the top of the priority. But then what tools, how can we make that website more workable and more useful for everybody that's involved in the process? And one area in particular we want to work more on is Appendix 4, in looking at auditor qualifications, what kind of training, what kind of background and experience might offset some qualification requirements, or I shouldn't say offset, but satisfy some qualification requirements. Are you already, for example, exemplar as an auditor? I'm sure we have some auditors on the call. Are you already exemplar global, which used to be RAB QSA certified? Are you already IRCA certified? What impact does that certification have on registration or certification as an SQFI ethical sourcing auditor? So some of those questions we're still kicking around internally and have not yet had a response to, or I'm sorry, we don't have an answer for it, but that is an area for future work. Okay, next slide, please. So with those comments, we'd like to turn it back over to Bob Garfield, Senior Vice President of SQFI, and to wrap up, and then we'll move into the Q&A section.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Mike, for an excellent presentation. I guess you've covered almost all of the issues except for the one probably that some people are asking is, when's this going to be available? And we are looking at the end of the third quarter, probably sometime late in September, to launch the program. We met yesterday with our website providers, and they guaranteed us that we can have the website up and running. We are already looking at the database and working on that to create a separate database for this program. So stay tuned on all that, but we are looking at the third quarter, the end of the third quarter, to start actually having people sign up, register, and get audited under this program. I think it's now appropriate that we open up the lines for questions. We're going to not open up the phone lines, but you got to type in. I'm sorry, I was corrected by my person here on the saying, don't open up the lines, please. What I meant by lines is to open up for your questions that you can type in to our two presenters. So what I'm going to do is just turn it back over to Steve and Mike to answer any questions that you might have. We have approximately about 15 or 20 minutes for that, so please ask your questions. Thank you. Steve, Mike, it's back to you.
Thanks, Bob. One of the questions that was already asked was, what is 17021? 17021 is the standard that all registrars have to conform to, and as Steve was talking about, it gives us guidance on things like audit days, by, as Steve had already said again, by how many people are in your company, things like that. It also talks about the quality of us as third-party auditors on things that we have to conform to be a third-party auditor. So it's just as all of you get audited, we get audited just as well. We'll actually have A and AB auditors accompany us in the field to watch us audit more of our continual improvement. They go into our offices and audit the office to make sure that all of our records are in place. So it's the kind of what goes around comes around as far as that goes. Also, there was one that was typed in about training, and I think I'm going to shoot that one back to SQFI on that one.
Thanks, Mike. I think we are planning to open up some training centers that will actually offer training and developing the system within your facility. I think maybe we might convince our friends across the table here to maybe open up the first training center at his organization at Eagle. And we're also going to be training auditors. And we're going to have a training program for auditors that are interested in learning the system as well. So that's all to come.
Hey, this is Steve. I'll take a couple. I noticed there's a question on, is the ethical sourcing component required to retain a facility's, in this case it says level 3, but SQF certification? And the answer to that is no. These are separate processes or programs. There's no requirement to implement the ethical sourcing standard in order to maintain your certification under the SQF Code 7th edition. And Bob, please correct me if I'm not correct.
You're absolutely correct. They're independent of one another.
Okay.
There's a question also, if the company has several facilities, will one audit be acceptable for the entire parent company? In this type of, and I'm going to answer, and then I'm going to go to Skip to see if he can confirm this, but we have a corporate certification that would basically take the corporate office and it would be audited, but then the different satellite facilities would be audited on some rotational basis. Right now we have facilities, not under SQF, but under other standards that use this, and it's quite effective and a cost savings as opposed to having each facility certified to a separate certificate. And is that correct on that, Skip?
Your explanation of a multi-site certification is correct, but quite frankly, we have not addressed the multi-site approach here at SQF because multi-site activities for both food and also the ethical sourcing are, under revision and under what I would call an evaluation on how we want to handle it. And again, the reason we're not trying to be evasive, but hopefully people can appreciate that food safety and multi-site activities carries a different burden than what we believe is necessary with ethical sourcing. Now, in saying that, as you heard all of us talk about, one of our commitments and one of the demands that the TAC charged us with the rewrite was they wanted a robust system that could stand alone as well as be a tag-along. And we think that that's what we have. I know one of the questions also was early on, I'm not seeing anything new or I'm not seeing anything different. Hopefully by the time you have at least heard Mike and Steve get through the whole thing, our commitment was not to eliminate the program, ethical sourcing. It truly was a rewrite. So we felt that we had, and the TAC felt we had a very good base system. It just needed strengthened, and that, in our opinion, is where we've come to. So again, the answer to support Mike's, we certainly appreciate the question on a multi-site. We recognize that that's an important piece for the larger companies, and we definitely will be dealing with that. Thank you.
Just one addition. Skip mentioned the word TAC, or the acronym TAC. It means Technical Advisory Council, which is what we use at SQF. It's a number of all of our constituents and stakeholders that form a deliberating body for us to help us with decision making. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Steve and Mike for further questions.
Okay.
There's one question on there. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, I'd like to just take a couple real quickly. One is on, bless you, whoever said we'd like to volunteer our organization as part of the pilots. And just so everybody knows, the question was, who do I contact? And the next slide is going to come up. Leslie, if you would, please. And we'll cover this in a minute, but this will give you the contact information for Sarah Milenich. And Sarah will be happy to, if you let her know by email, she'll be happy to contact you in return. Okay? And there's a couple of questions that relate to whether or not various supplier organizations or sourcing organizations might accept the certification in place of their own audit requirements. I don't think it's appropriate for us to specify organizations, but there's a follow-up question here that's more generic that says, are there buyers accepting the certification now? The certification is not formally in place yet, but yes, there are some sourcing organizations that have said that once this is all in place, that they would certainly give it, that they feel that it meets their requirements or exceeds their requirements in one case. But I don't think it's appropriate yet at this point to mention any names, Bob, unless you feel differently.
No, I think, Skip, Steve, that's appropriate. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
And there's a question on there about if you choose to undergo ethical sourcing certification process and decide to start with level 1, is it expected that you eventually go to level 3 ES certification? That's going to be up to the other requirements that we talked about earlier. Do you have a requirement that drives you to level 3? Do you have a customer that would be satisfied that if you're a level 1 or a level 2? Those are all, I hate to use this, but as an old environmental instructor, it depends. Those are the kind of things that we were talking about as far as what would drive you to proceed through the program. If you enter at a level 1 and want to stay at a level 1, that's where you would be audited to for the duration of the program.
There's a question about receiving a printout of the presentation. Sarah, I believe we talked about possibly making this available online.
Yes, the presentation and the recording will be available on our website in about 7 to 10 days. So stay tuned for that.
And any any questions that come from now until next week, if there's time, those will all also be answered and available on the website. I'm sorry, I probably should let you speak to this slide, which may answer a number of these questions. So, would you like to do that?
Actually, we are going to tally all the questions and get back to each individual on a separate basis. And then also, like you said, Steve, also the questions will be available on our website as well.
Okay.
This is Skip. I'd like, early on there was a question on living wage and also bonded labor, and I think it's a good question in terms of what we've talked about over the last year and a half with regards to both what I would call the European-centric approach versus, other worldwide areas. And with regards to the living wage, we're comfortable saying that we discussed that, and this is my opinion, so obviously as we go forward things can change, but we certainly are going to deal with minimum wage, and that's in the standard that will be dealt with very specifically. But the idea of living wage, is a good example that it's like social responsibility, and what do you believe is your obligation to contribute to the local charity or national charities, whatever. That's such a personal choice. We are not trying to deal with that in this particular, standard. The same thing with living wage. Who are we to define and describe as, a scheme owner, and quite frankly, as an accreditation body and also as a certification body, what truly is, the proper living wage? A wonderful social question, and we certainly appreciate, that some people need to address it, but I think it's a good example that we're not prepared to address it, now, and whether that changes, we'll see. And similar to the bonded labor, the standard bonded labor we recognize is still practiced, in some countries, and to say that the standard, will deal with bonded labor, but it'll be pretty straightforward because, again, our commitment is to emphasize North and South America, and we're not trying, to move into the total world, although we know that with our participation in the commitment of SQI with the association with GSCP becomes very critical that we can, again, walk before we run with regards to moving into more worldwide issues and activities, and that's an important piece of the whole best practices of GSCP and what, we feel very good about the association and what we can offer in the future. So, thank you.
Okay, this is Steve. There's a question on, is there a total of 4 audits in the period of 3 years? No, actually in the first 3 years there would be 3. You would have your initial certification audit, let's say this year. In 2015 you would have your first surveillance audit, 2016 your second surveillance audit, and then 2017 would be a recertification audit. It would not be a registration assessment because you're already certified. It would be a recertification. So in the first 3 years there would be 3 audits. Next question was, are you looking for specific categories for these audits? I believe that might reference whether or not it's small facilities, medium facilities, large facilities, and I think I will have to rely on giving an answer back to that so we can check with who's already signed up for audits, which might help target that question a little better. So whoever asked that, if you could send maybe that to Sarah individually, and then we could give you a targeted reply to that, I think that would be helpful.
We have the base small and large and medium size covered, so we're really open and flexible to some more pilots. And Steve, if I could interpret the category for somebody is probably referring to a different industry or a particular industry. That's not important to us with regards to what we're trying to get answered. So we can pretty much live with any business activity, which also includes the non-food, even though we know that particularly for the first year, the emphasis and the activity will be built around, food businesses. We know we've gotten a lot of interest and inquiries for non-food people also. Thank you.
There's a question, can a facility that is already certified go through the GSCP equivalence assessment? If I read that correctly, I'm saying that that's certified to the SQFI Ethical Sourcing Standard, and can they go through the GSCP equivalence assessment? I'm not sure that I could answer that. I guess I would take an attempt to say that that's a lengthy and not inexpensive process, but I don't know that there's any connection between the certification either to the Ethical Sourcing Code or to the SQF Code and the equivalence assessment. That probably would be best answered by GSCP themselves. Bob or Skip, would you have anything to add to that?
Yes, Steve. I believe that a facility that has a program, and there are facilities that do it, can go through the GSCP process. I think it's mostly larger companies that have gone through that. It is, like you said, a very lengthy process and also extremely costly. So doing the ethical sourcing code would be a good step towards that. If you were certified under the ethical sourcing code, it would be a good step. Unlike GFSI, though, GSCP doesn't either recognize or not recognize a facility. What they do is they sort of evaluate you best on their practices and either equate you to either say your program is better than, equal to, or less than what they are offering as the worldwide best practices. And based on that, they put your numbers or where you stand on their website and so that others can see where your program stands. But they don't recognize or not recognize any particular system or program. So at the end of the process that we're going through now, those that are interested in in ethical sourcing can go to the GSCP website and see how the expert committee from GSCP evaluated our program against the GSCP standards. You won't see that we're recognized by GSCP, but you will be able to see that evaluation that they conducted on our program. That's it. Back to you, Steve.
Okay. Another question is, what does this mean for organizations that are already certified for the ethical sourcing piece of SQF, which I take it as the first edition voluntary module? And Bob, perhaps you could address that, please.
Yes, when this is in place next year, you'll have the opportunity to move to the new revised ethical sourcing standard. The old one won't be available anymore.
Okay. Sorry, Mike, if you've already looked at one, please feel free.
That's what I'm doing right now. I'm looking at some of these are in regards to training and CBs that are already under SQF. What will they need to do? Those I'm sure that SQFI will answer when they get back with those folks on those as far as those type of questions. Steve, I don't see any others except for the ones that we just mentioned in regards to training and in regards to CBs getting certified to audit to ES that I don't think we haven't answered.
Yeah, I do see one more that is a little bit of a follow-on to that question about how many audits in the first 3 years. And this is asking, is the initial certification audit, would it be in 2 parts? The answer is yes, but it's not 2 separate visits to the site. First one, part of that would be a document review, which again would be similar to the desk audit of the SQF Food Code. That would be done remotely by the facility providing the documents for the auditor's review, and accompanied then as a follow-up by the on-site visit. So there would be 2 stages in the first year. There is the on-site stage 1 and on-site stage 2 that's required. That's the only year that there would be the 2 audits.
And there's a question that says, if 2 companies share the same facility, do we need to 2 separate certifications? One of the things that we're provided with is an annual boot camp, and this was covered in depth this year as far as the term organization. And if these are 2 completely separate companies with 2 completely separate different managements, groups, and if they both wanted to be certified, the answer would be yes, it would be 2 separate certifications.
Steve and Mike, if I could, maybe I can address some of the issues about training of auditors and that sort of thing. We have sent out the draft, the final documents to a number of CBs that have expressed interest. In that is the auditor requirements, and so if any CB is interested in having auditors conduct this program, then we'll be happy to send you the auditor requirements. And we are working with Steve and Mike and Eagle to set up a training program for auditors to understand how the system works, and that will be offered as well towards this September period. Is there a final question or 2? If we do, we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Steve and Mike, if you have one. If not, then we can close it out.
And here's a follow-up to the answer drove another question. If one company gets certified, will it affect the other company in the same facility? No. If only one of the companies are, and again, looking at the term organization, if there are 2 complete companies, it would not affect the other one.
There's also a question on when you say small, medium, and large facility for the pilot, what are you talking about? The size of the facility itself, the revenue in the facility, et cetera. Again, kind of both. I like to say, size really is employees, but in this case, obviously facilities has some impact, but we identify small as being less than 50, medium being 50, to 500, and over 500 being large. That's, again, a rough back of the envelope, comment. It's what you define yourself is more important to us, quite frankly, than, we're just using it as a guideline. So.
All right, with that, I think we're going to close it out now. Keep in mind that this will be available on the SQFI website on July 16th. Exactly, on July 16th. So if you want to get a copy of it, it'll be available then. If you have any questions, please send them to Sarah, and then if it's technical questions, Sarah won't answer them. That's what we're going to rely on Steve and Mike to do. But we'll be happy to entertain anybody that's interested in running a pilot program. We have several now under our belt. We're looking at a number more. As more that we do, the better we'll be when we come to launch this in September. I want to thank Eagle personally and Skip for all the work they've done on this and the support that they've given us to get us to this point, and to Steve and Mike, who have done an exemplary job, if I can use that term, in putting this all together, to taking us from where we were to where we are today. I think this is a great product. It'll be a great service for the food industry and others that support the food industry, and we're looking forward to launching it at the end of September. So thank you all for attending, and with that, we'll sign off. Thanks again. Bye-bye.